the US, Las Vegas police say at least 50 people have died. More than 200 others have sustained serious injuries in a mass shooting in Las Vegas. It happened Sunday night at the Mandalay Bay Resort at Country Music Festival. It is one of the deadliest shootings in American history after last year's massacre at an Orlando nightclub. Investigators are not calling it a terror attack yet. Here's the latest.
The United States is reeling from another mass shooting, this time in the city of Las Vegas, a city that brings in more than 3 million visitors every year, packed with tourists, gamblers and shoppers who quickly rushed for cover around 10 p.m. local time when shots rang out. Police say on Sunday night, the suspect, 64-year-old Stephen Paddock, fired shots from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort Hotel. Paddock opened fire and hurt hundreds of others at a country musical festival before police shot and killed him. Thousands of people panicked and fled the scene, in some cases trampling others as they tried to escape the chaos. Witnesses say hundreds of shots rang out and it sounded like fireworks. Police are still trying to figure out the motive in the deadly shooting. Police say he is not connected to any militant group. Police have found numerous firearms in his room and say he is from Las Vegas. Authorities believe Paddock's roommate, Mary Lou Danley, is also being questioned and have located the 2 cars that belong to the suspect. Police have not released the victims' identities but say 2 off-duty police officers are among the dead. Many casinos locked their doors during the active shooting, while others locked themselves in their hotel rooms with the lights off. The shooting happened in the final night of the 3-day Route 91 Harvest Festival with top acts including Jason Aldean. US President Donald Trump offered his condolences to the victims. Many victims are now at a local hospital, several in critical condition. The hotel is near the McCarran International Airport, which temporarily suspended flights because of the shooting. Nearby freeways and roads are now back open. The Mandalay Bay Resort tweeted, "Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of last night's tragic events. We are grateful for the immediate actions of our first responders." MGM Resort said this evening there was a tragic active shooter situation at the south end of the Las Vegas Strip. Law enforcement and emergency personnel responded quickly to the incident and secured the scene. Law enforcement requested that we put hotels in the vicinity on lockdown to ensure guest safety. Bureau Report, WION.
And this is what American President Donald Trump had to say.
My fellow Americans, we are joined together today in sadness, shock, and grief. Last night, a gunman opened fire on a large crowd at a country music concert in Las Vegas, Nevada. He brutally murdered more than 50 people and wounded hundreds more. It was an act of pure evil. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are working closely with local authorities to assist with the investigation, and they will provide updates as to the investigation and how it develops. I want to thank the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and all of the first responders for their courageous efforts and for helping to save the lives of so many. The speed with which they acted is miraculous and prevented further loss of life. To have found the shooter so quickly after the first shots were fired is something for which we will always be thankful and grateful. It shows what true professionalism is all about.
And joining us now from Washington, WION's correspondent Kevin McLeese with us from Washington. As I said, Glenn Carl, former intelligence officer from Massachusetts. Puneet Ahluwalia, Republican leader and political and business consultant, also with us from Washington. Good evening to all of you. Kevin, let me begin with you. What has the investigation established so far?
Well, so far we know that the gunman was a Stephen Paddock, age 64, a white male. We know that he opened fire from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel and Casino in the south end of the Vegas Strip. He did so just after 10 p.m. local time, firing down from that vantage point into some 22,000 gathered concert goers at a Vegas country music festival. 50 people plus have been killed, 200 injured, and some 400 in total were actually taken to hospital. The suspect was found dead, police say, by self-inflicted gun wounds when they charged into that hotel room, and they found in excess of 10 rifles there. The local sheriff, Joe Lombardo, described this as a lone wolf attack. They are not linking this with terrorism at this stage, but they are stressing this investigation will be long-running.
How serious are the injuries? Is the death toll expected to go up?
Well, we now have confirmation that 58 people have been dead. This obviously is now the deadliest mass US shooting in US history. Number will rise, according to the sheriff in Vegas. Hundreds of injuries. These injuries obviously being sustained by the gunfire that was raining down. Hundreds of rounds are being reported left that hotel room. So you can expect these kinds of injuries to be extremely traumatic. Local hospitals, trauma units there under pressure to be dealing with this sudden influx of major injuries which will require major surgery. I think there have been calls in Las Vegas from these hospitals for blood donations for those victims. But certainly when you're talking about gunfire from weapons, heavy weapons such as assault weapons, then you're looking at some serious injuries.
Reuters reported about an hour back that ISIS has claimed responsibility for this attack, but authorities aren't calling it a terror attack yet, are they?
Authorities not calling this a terror attack, certainly not the Las Vegas police, who have been updating us since last night's tragic event. There have been some circulations on social media about possible links to extremism. That is not being talked about at the moment. We heard from the suspects, the gunman's brother, who said that he had no sort of relation to extremism, that this was entirely out of the blue as an event, and that the man himself, police say, had no record, police record of any consequence. They talk about a citation a few years back, but wouldn't elaborate on that at the moment. But yes, there is nothing at the moment to suggest there is any terrorism link, certainly not being suggested by the police force investigating this. But this is just the early stages of what will be a very contracted and long-running investigation.
Right, we're waiting for more to come up, and we understand that the Las Vegas police are addressing the press as we speak. Glenn Carl, it's a tragic day. Our thoughts, of course, with the families of the victims and the people of America who've seen another tragedy, one of its biggest, I'm told, one of the biggest mass shootings in American history. But I have to ask you this. Why is it that some killers are branded shooters while others are terrorists?
That's a good question. It is a political decision and largely driven with terrible consequences long term by the hostility of fundamentally one party in the United States against Muslims. Now, it's true that Muslims have engaged in jihadism for a number of years, for 2 decades or more, and that there are problems with terrorist groups, but the reflexive characterization you describe it is based upon an unthinking, visceral, emotional, at best, response, and sometimes actually racism. In this instance, we have the marriage of 300 million private weapons in the United States with 320 million citizens. A reasonable percentage are mentally unstable or politically motivated. happens.
Puneet Ahluwalia, do you hold the system responsible for this tragedy, the failure to limit access to guns in America?
I guess this is the question that goes again. Now I feel there's a failure on the part of the media and glorifying these actors who feel empowered to go out and do these crazy things. It's a sad day. It's a disappointing, it's painful day to wake up to this tragic news. I feel that we will find a solution to this problem. But it's more important to tell the stories about the people who sacrificed, and at the same time are police officers who came out and were in a very fast moment able to take or killed himself. Otherwise, there would have been four tragedies that would be great.
Your voice is breaking. We'll try and reconnect with you. But what I could hear very clearly was you blaming the media yet again. It's incredible how you do that. 58 people have died. It's not the media's fault. It is something that we have to report. Glenn Carl, why do successive governments fail when it comes to gun control in America?
This is the critical question. I would like to add one important, I think, point before I answer that. And why is this probably not terrorism, and we characterize other things as terrorism? It's not purely a visceral, racist or religious-based response. Terrorism is politically motivated violence, and this seems to be violence motivated by, from what we can tell, nothing. Now, had a white person, white American, done this with a political intent, such as the Oklahoma bombing before, that was terrorism, yes. Now, why have we not succeeded in doing anything? It's the combination here of how money corrupts the political system, and there are few controls on the use of money, how powerful the National Rifle Association lobby is, and how they are more than influential. They have a controlling influence many times with Republican leaders who depend on them for their money and their support. So despite the fact that over 80% of Americans want much stronger gun control laws of all different types, nonetheless, one party overwhelmingly votes against it because, to put it baldly, they're paid off.
Puneet Ahluwalia, your thoughts on this, and what do you think the current president, whom you support so strongly, is going to do to ensure that a tragedy like this is not repeated in America?
Any tragedy of loss of American life and innocent life is a pain and a loss to a nation and to the community and the world at large. And that's kind of what I hear is complete baloney. If you look at our fundamental, you look at our amendment, the Second Amendment, the right of owning a firearm and protecting ourselves, that's a very inside the American DNA, to protect ourselves in case the government becomes too big, too strong, and want to take away our rights. Hence the reason why the guns are important to us. I'm a gun owner. I'm proud to be a gun owner. But it's all about to protect ourselves and our way of life. At the same time, saying that the NRA and all these people pay these politicians off is a bunch of baloney. I've never paid anybody off. It's just to protect me and my family and my community and the American way of life. And I'm very also confident that President Trump, who listens to the people, who deals directly with the people, will find a way that would basically find a way which will be healing the American public, which is really, this is a very painful time for us, to lose so many people in one, wake up to a loss which is great. And I guess you will see in the coming months and days that there'll be positive changes coming to this.
We hope there is. From the latest that we've been told, more than 500 people have sustained injuries, and the death toll is at 58. The police in Las Vegas saying that as far as they know right now, this shooter was not linked to any terror organization. I'm going to thank you all, Glenn Carl, Puneet and Kevin, who was joining us from Washington. Thank you very much. It has, in fact, been a weekend of attacks, from a lone wolf man who stabbed 2 women in Marseille in France, to a lone wolf driver with an ISIS flag on his front seat who drove into a police picket and stabbed a policeman in Canada, and now another kind of lone wolf in the land of liberal gun licenses. How differently do Europe and the US handle terror from Islamist groups? Senior foreign editor Padma Rao examines that question.
It's not been long since a man mowed down 14 people with his truck in Barcelona in Spain. The attack was the third of its kind in Europe alone. The earlier two instances of truck drivers willfully driving into crowds occurred in Nice in France and in Berlin in Germany. Last week, a man stabbed two women to death at a railway station in Marseille in France. All the attacks were by Islamist criminals. In the country which is at the helm of the anti-terror war being waged in the Middle East and supported by European nations, the United States, it's quite a different picture. There are other instances of violence, but not Islamist terror attacks. Let's break down where, how many, and importantly, why. Let's compare the United States with Europe as far as Islamist terror is concerned. The terror attack on 9/11 took 3,000 casualties. Between 2001 and 2017, there were only 94 casualties. In Europe, between 2001 and 2017, there were 637 casualties. Security analysts point to a curious factor. The United States leads the war against Islamist terrorism across the world and in its epicenter in Afghanistan, Pakistan. It is several times larger than Europe. Its cities are far more densely populated. And yet, the United States has yet to see a mass attack with a weapon as everyday as a truck, as has been the case in Europe. But there is one weapon in the United States which is almost as easily available as a killer truck, a gun. For long, gun control laws have been fiercely debated, but little has been done. The tragic killing of more than 50 people, with more than 100 seriously injured at a music concert in Las Vegas, was at the hands of a man who rained bullets down upon the crowd and was later killed by the police himself. And no, he was not an Islamist terrorist, is what we know, but a man called Stephen, whom the police described as a local resident. Now let's look at the modes of terror in the United States and in Europe. In the 2001, that is the 9/11 attack, it was a hijack and it were air crashes that were the primary modes of terror in the United States. As for guns, there are 10,000 homicides and 20,000 suicides every year. In Europe, on the other hand, trucks driven through crowded markets, attacks on music halls, public transport and taking hostages have been the most common modes of terror between 2001 and 2017. But if the United States is an industrialized economic superpower, so are the states of the European Union. And yet there are differences in both the nature of terror as well as the laws to deal with it. Let's look at the structures in the United States and in Europe. In the United States, there is unified intelligence sharing and law enforcement between individual US states. In Europe, there is a lack of routine intelligence sharing and coordination between individual EU countries. In the US, there's tough homeland security at entry to the United States. There are uniform laws in all the states, and the distance from the Middle East is greater than in Europe. In Europe, there are open, porous borders and differing laws in individual EU states, and the continent is much closer to the Middle East. In the United States, there are 90 million weapons in private possession due to lax gun control laws. In Europe, automatic weapons have been banned. 10% of Europeans own firearms, whereas 41% of Americans have guns. It's also the nature of public discourse that varies. Let's take a look at public support in the United States compared to Europe. In the United States, there is nearly 100% support for zero-tolerance anti-terror policies, whereas there's only 55% support for stricter gun control policies. In Europe, civil liberty activists put stops on surveillance, stress privacy laws, but there is majority support for stricter gun control policies. And finally, there are more Western Europeans fighting along with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria as compared to the United States. Only about 100 Americans joined the renegade terror group, while almost 4,000 Europeans have traveled to join the Islamic State. While the US Muslim population overall is less than 1% of the total population and better integrated, the European Muslim population ranges from between 5 and 10% of the population. And with the influx of refugees escaping the wars that the same West has created and Europe's welcome all policies based on human rights, that number is swelling exponentially. But with the worst killings since 9/11 taking place in Las Vegas in the United States last night, America may now be facing a new old enemy, its own gun culture. Padma Rao, WION.